We call them the Dark Ages. The centuries in Europe between the fall of the Western Roman Empire around the year 476 and the slow reawakening of the High Middle Ages around the year 1000. The name conjures a single grim picture: filthy peasants huddling in mud, a Europe plunged into ignorance and chaos, knowledge extinguished, cities abandoned, civilization itself flickering out like a snuffed candle. A few centuries of nothing, a black hole between Rome and the cathedrals. Almost everything in that picture is wrong, or at least badly distorted. The people who lived in these centuries did not think they were living in the dark. They farmed, they traded, they wrote, they prayed, they built, they fought, and they fell in love in a world that was poorer and more dangerous than Rome at its height. Yes, but that was also inventing the foundations of the Europe to come. Today, we are going to strip away the myth and step into what life in so-called Dark Age Europe was actually like. Using advanced AI trained on the archaeology of early medieval settlements, the surviving law codes and chronicles of the period, the grave goods buried with the dead, the pollen and bone evidence recovered from the soil, and the work of modern historians who have spent the last century dismantling the myth of the Dark Ages, we have reconstructed the real texture of these centuries. The first thing to understand is why we ever called them dark in the first place. The phrase was coined, much later, by people with an agenda. Scholars of the Renaissance, and afterward, in love with the glory of classical Rome and Greece, looked back at the centuries that followed Rome's collapse and saw mainly what had been lost: the grand cities, the central government, the long roads, the mass literacy, the monumental architecture. Compared to the marble splendor of imperial Rome, the smaller, rougher, more rural world that followed looked like a catastrophe, and they branded it the Dark Ages. But this comparison hides as much as it reveals. The Roman world that these scholars admired was built on slavery, on conquest, on staggering inequality, and on a fragile system that, when it broke for reasons that had little to do with the people who came after. And the world that replaced it was not empty, it was simply different. So what was daily life actually like? For the vast majority of people, life was rural. Most people lived in small villages or scattered farmsteads, in timber-framed houses with walls of woven branches packed with mud and dung, roofed with thatch. A typical family house was a single long room, often shared at one end with the family's most valuable animals during the cold months, both for warmth and for safety. A central hearth provided heat, light, and cooking, the smoke escaping through a hole in the roof or simply seeping out through the thatch. This sounds miserable to modern ears, and it was hard, but it was also functional, warm, and far more sophisticated than the word hovel suggests. These houses were well built by skilled hands, repaired and maintained across generations, and surprisingly cozy with a fire burning and the family and animals inside on a winter night. The food was simple, but in good years, adequate. The staple was bread, dark and heavy, made from barley, rye, or wheat depending on the region. Alongside it came pottage, a thick stew of grains, beans, peas, and whatever vegetables were available, simmered for hours in a pot over the hearth, with a little salt pork or bacon for flavor when it could be had. People ate cabbages, onions, leeks, turnips, and wild greens. They gathered nuts, berries, and mushrooms from the forests. They kept chickens for eggs, pigs for meat, and in many places cattle, sheep, or goats for milk, cheese, and wool. They fished the rivers and the sea. They drank ale, and in wine-growing regions, wine, both safer than much of the available water. In a good year, an ordinary family ate a monotonous but sufficient diet. In a bad year, after a failed harvest, they starved, and famine was a real and recurring terror. But here is the crucial thing the myth gets wrong: the lights did not go out. Across these centuries, in the monasteries that spread across Europe, monks were copying and preserving the texts of the ancient world by hand, page by laborious page, keeping alive the works of Roman and Greek authors that would otherwise have been lost forever. Much of what we know today of classical literature survives only because Dark Age monks chose to copy it. In Ireland, which had never been part of the Roman Empire and was never invaded by the Germanic tribes, a brilliant monastic culture flourished, producing dazzling illuminated manuscripts and sending missionaries and scholars back across a Europe that had, in places, forgotten how to read. In the kingdom of the Franks, a ruler named Charlemagne, crowned emperor in the year 800, presided over a genuine revival of learning, art, and architecture, gathering scholars from across Europe to his court and standardizing a clear, beautiful style of handwriting that we still, in modified form, use as the basis of our lowercase letters today. The Dark Ages produced epic poetry, sophisticated law codes, remarkable metalwork, and some of the most beautiful objects ever made by human hands. The technology of these centuries was also advancing, not retreating. The heavy plough, capable of turning the dense, wet soils of northern Europe that the lighter Roman plough could not manage, spread across the continent and dramatically increased the amount of land that could be farmed. The horse collar, which allowed horses to pull heavy loads without choking, transformed agriculture and transport. The three-field system of crop rotation, which let farmers keep more of their land productive each year, slowly raised the food supply. Watermills spread across the rivers of Europe, grinding grain with the power of moving water and freeing human and animal labor for other work. These were not the achievements of a stagnant, ignorant age. They were the slow, steady innovations of practical people solving real problems, and together they would eventually produce the agricultural surplus that powered the great medieval boom of towns, cathedrals, and universities. Society was organized in ways both harsh and surprisingly intricate. At the top sat warrior elites, kings and their war bands, whose power rested on their ability to win battles, reward followers with land and treasure, and protect their people from raiders. Below them stretched a complex web of free farmers, semi-free peasants tied to the land, and, in the earlier centuries, outright slaves, though slavery slowly gave way across this period to forms of serfdom. Loyalty was personal. A man swore an oath to his lord, and that bond of mutual obligation, protection in exchange for service, was the glue that held society together in the absence of the old Roman state. This personal, oath-bound structure would, over centuries, develop into what we call feudalism. Women's lives were constrained by law and custom, but in practice, many women ran farms, managed households, brewed and sold ale, owned property, and in the case of certain abbesses and queens, wielded real political power. It was, without question, a dangerous age. The collapse of Roman central authority meant that there was no longer a single great power keeping the peace across the continent. Waves of migration and invasions swept across Europe, Germanic peoples settling in the old Roman provinces, then later the terrifying raids of the Vikings from the north, the Magyars from the east, and Muslim raiders along the Mediterranean coasts. Travel was hazardous, local violence was common, life expectancy was short, infant mortality was appalling, and disease was a constant companion. But people did not experience their own lives as a tragic interlude between two golden ages. They experienced them as life, full of work and worry, festival and faith, family and feud, exactly as people always have. And slowly, across these centuries, the foundations of modern Europe were laid. The kingdoms that emerged from the wreckage of Rome, the Franks, the Anglo-Saxons, the Visigoths, the Lombards, would become the ancestors of France, England, Spain, Italy, Germany. The Christian Church, spreading across the continent through its monasteries and missionaries, became the one institution that bound Europe together, preserving literacy, providing a common language in Latin, and slowly weaving a shared identity across a patchwork of warring kingdoms. The languages people spoke in their villages were evolving into the early forms of the European languages we know today. The legal traditions, the agricultural systems, the social bonds, even the field boundaries in much of the European countryside were being set in place during exactly the centuries we dismiss as dark. That was what life was really like in Dark Age Europe. Not a black hole of ignorance and mud, but a poorer, rougher, more dangerous, more rural world that was nonetheless alive with farming and faith, with craft and learning, with innovation and ambition, slowly building the Europe that was to come out of the ruins of the one that had fallen. The cities were smaller, the roads were worse, the luxuries of Rome were gone. But the people were not in the dark. They were in monasteries and villages and royal courts across the continent, quietly keeping the flame alive and inventing the future. The name Dark Ages tells us far more about the people who coined it. Dazzled by Rome and contemptuous of what followed, than it does about the people who actually lived through these remarkable, misunderstood centuries. History remembers them as an absence. They were, in truth, a beginning. See the Iliad story in the Paladin app, out now.